A tank destroyer or tank hunter is a type of armored fighting vehicle, armed with a direct-fire artillery gun or missile launcher, with limited operational capacities and designed specifically to engage enemy armored vehicles. Tanks are generally armored fighting vehicles designed for frontline combat which combine operational mobility and tactical offensive and defensive capabilities and perform all primary tasks of the armored troops on the battlefield. The tank destroyer, on the other hand, is specifically designed mainly for taking on enemy armor. Many have been based on a tracked tank chassis, while others are wheeled. Since World War II, gun-armed tank destroyers have fallen out of favor as armies have favored multi-role main battle tanks. However, lightly armored anti-tank guided missile carriers are commonly used for supplementary long-range anti-tank work. The resurgence of expeditionary warfare in the past 20 years has seen the emergence of gun-armed wheeled vehicles, sometimes called protected gun systems, which may bear a superficial resemblance to tank destroyers, but are employed as direct fire support units, typically providing support in low-intensity operations such as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. World War II. Dedicated anti-tank vehicles made their first major appearance in the Second World War as combatants developed effective armored vehicles and tactics. Some were little more than stopgap solutions, mounting an anti-tank gun on a tracked vehicle to give mobility, while others were more sophisticated designs. An example of the development of tank destroyer technology throughout the war are the Marder III and Hetzer vehicle, that were very different in spite of being based on the same chassis. Marder was straightforwardly an anti-tank gun on tracks, whereas Hetzer traded some firepower for better armor protection and ease of concealment on the battlefield. Except for most American designs, tank destroyers were all turretless and had fixed or casemate superstructures. When a tank destroyer was used against enemy tanks from a defensive position such as by ambush, the common lack of a rotating turret was not particularly critical, while the lower silhouette was highly desirable. The turretless design allowed accommodation of a more powerful gun, typically a dedicated anti-tank gun that had a longer barrel than could be mounted in a turreted tank on the same chassis. The lack of a turret increased the vehicle's internal volume, allowing for increased ammunition stowage and crew comfort. Eliminating the turret allowed the vehicle to carry thicker armor than would otherwise be the case, and also allowed this armor to be concentrated in the hull. Sometimes there was no armored roof to keep the overall weight down to the limit that the chassis could bear. The absence of a turret meant that tank destroyers could be manufactured significantly cheaper, faster and more easily than the tanks on which they were based, and found particular favor when production resources were lacking. After hard lessons early in the war, machine guns were mounted for use against infantry, but the limited traverse of the mounting meant that they were still less effective than those used on turreted tanks. Polish variants of the Polish TKS and TK3 tankets up-armed with 20mm gun were operationally deployed in the invasion of Poland. They were used as an anti-tank component of the reconnaissance units. French. Due to the quick defeat of France, few French vehicles were built. The Lafly W15 TCC was an attempt to quickly build a light tank destroyer by mounting a 47mm SA-37 anti-tank gun onto a lightly armored Lafly W15T artillery tractor. Other French tank destroyers were being developed, including the SOMUS AL-40, ARLV-39 and various ad hoc conversions of the Lorraine 37L. The first German tank destroyers were the Panzerjäger, which took an existing anti-tank gun and mounted it on a convenient chassis to give mobility, usually with just a three-sided gun shield for crew protection. For instance, 202 obsolete Panzer I light tanks were modified by removing the turret and were rebuilt as the Panzerjäger I self-propelled Skoda 47mm anti-tank gun. Similarly, Panzer II tanks were used on the Eastern Front. captured Soviet 76.2 mm anti-tank guns were mounted on modified Panzer II chassis, producing the Marder II self-propelled anti-tank gun. The most common mounting was a German 75 mm anti-tank gun on the Czech Panzer 38 chassis to produce the Marder III. The Panzer 38 chassis was also used to make the Jagdpanzer 38 Hetzer casemate-style tank destroyer. The Panzer Jaeger series continued up to the 88 mm equipped Nashorn. German tank destroyers based on the Panzer III and later German tanks were unique in that they had more armor than their tank counterparts. One of the more successful German tank destroyers was actually designed as a self-propelled artillery gun, the Sturmgeschütz III. Based on the Panzer III tank chassis, the Sturmgeschütz III was originally fitted with a low-velocity gun, and was assigned to the artillery arm for infantry fire support. Later, after encountering Soviet tanks, it was refitted with a comparatively short-barreled high-velocity anti-tank gun, usually with a muzzle brake, enabling it to function as a tank destroyer. The Sturmgeschütz III from its 1938 origin used a new casemate-style superstructure with an integrated design similar to the later Jagdpanzer II. Completely enclosed the crew. It was employed in infantry support and offensive armored operations as well as in the defensive anti-tank role. The Stug III was the most produced German armored fighting vehicle of any type built during the war years, with some 10,000 examples built from January 1940 through March 1945. Although the early German Panzer Jaeger carried more effective weapons than the tanks on which they were based, they were generally lacking in protection for the crew, having thinly armored open-topped superstructures. The open-topped design format of the Panzer Jaeger vehicles was succeeded by the Jagdpanzer, which mounted the gun in true casemate-style superstructures, completely enclosing the crew compartment in armor that would usually be integral to the hull. The first of these Jagdpanzers was the Ferdinand, a 70-ton monster built from the already built quantity of 91 Porsche VK4501-based Tiger I, losing contract contenders' hulls and drive systems, mounting a long-barreled 88 mm cannon in an added casemate, more like the earlier Panzer Jaegers had, with their added-on armor shielding for the gun crew, but in the Elephant completely enclosing the gun and firing crew in the added casemate, as the later purpose-built Jagdpanzers would. However, the Elephant proved to be mechanically unreliable and difficult to maneuver, and once all 91 unturreted Porsche Tiger hulls drive systems were converted, no more were built. The German army had more success with the Jagdpanther. Introduced in mid-1944, the Jagdpanther was considered the best of the casemate-designed Jagdpanzer designs. It featured the same powerful PaK 43 88 mm cannon used on the unwieldy Elephant, now fitted to the chassis of the medium Panther tank, providing greatly improved armor-penetrating capability in a medium-weight vehicle. Facing an increasingly defensive war, the German army turned to larger and more powerfully armed Jagdpanzer designs, and in July 1944 the first Jagd Tiger rolled off the production line. It was the heaviest German armored fighting vehicle to go into active service. The Jagd Tiger featured a huge 128 mm PaK 44 cannon and heavy armor protection. Only 88 Jagd Tiger vehicles were produced, barely matching the total number of the earlier Ferdinand Elephant vehicles. They were first deployed to combat units in September 1944. The decision of German armored vehicle designers to use a casemate-style superstructure for all tank destroyers had the advantage of a reduced silhouette, allowing the crew to more frequently fire from defilade ambush positions. Such designs were also easier and faster to manufacture and offered good crew protection from artillery fire and shell splinters. However, the lack of a rotating turret limited the gun's traverse to a few degrees. If the vehicle became immobilized due to engine failure or track damage, it could not rotate its gun to counter opposing tanks. making it highly vulnerable to counterfire. This vulnerability was later exploited by opposing tank forces. Even the largest and most powerful of German tank destroyers were found abandoned on the field after a battle, having been immobilized by one or more hits by high explosive or armor-piercing shells to the track or front drive sprocket. Soviet. As with the Germans of 1943, most of the Soviet designs mounted anti-tank guns, with limited traversing casemate-style turretless hulls, in a general design format looking much like the Germans' own Jagdpanzer vehicles. The Soviets produced high numbers of the 85mm Su-85 and 100mm Su-100 self-propelled guns based on the same chassis as the T-34 medium tank, as well as the 122mm ISU-122 and 152mm ISU-152, which shared components with the IS-2 heavy tank and was nicknamed Zavero Boy for its ability to destroy German Tigers, Panthers and Elephants. The predecessor of the ISU-152 was the Su-152, built on the KV-1S chassis and shared many similarities with the ISU-152. The ISU-152, built as a heavy assault gun, relied on the weight of the shell fired from its M-1937 43 howitzer to defeat tanks. In 1943, the Soviets also shifted all production of light tanks like the T-70 to much simpler and better armed Su-76 self-propelled guns, which used the same drivetrain. The Su-76 was originally designed as an anti-tank vehicle, but was soon relegated to the infantry support role. American U.S. Army and counterpart British designs were very different in conception. U.S. doctrine was based, in light of the fall of France, on the perceived need to defeat German blitzkrieg tactics, and U.S. units expected to be faced with large numbers of German tanks attacking on relatively narrow fronts. These were expected to break through a thin screen of anti-tank guns. Hence the decision that the main anti-tank units, the tank destroyer battalions, should be concentrated and very mobile. In actual practice, such German attacks rarely happened. Throughout the war, only one battalion ever fought in an engagement quite like that which had originally been envisaged. Only a few shots were expected to be fired from any firing position. Strong reconnaissance elements were provided so that TDs would be able to use pre-arranged firing positions to best advantage. Flanking fire by TDs was emphasized, both to penetrate thinner enemy side armor, and to reduce the likelihood of accurate enemy return fire. All American tank destroyers were officially known by exactly the same collective term used for American self-propelled artillery ordnance: gun motor carriage. The designs were intended to be very mobile and heavily armed. Most of the tank hull-based designs used special open-topped turrets, of a differing design to the original tank it was to be based on, which was meant to both save weight and to accommodate a larger gun. The earliest expedient design was an M3 half-track mounting an M1897 75mm gun in a limited traverse mount, and called the 75mm gun motor carriage M3. Another, considerably less successful, early design mounted a 37mm anti-tank gun in the bed of a Dodge 3/4-ton truck, the 37mm GMC M6. By far the most common U.S. design was the 3" gun motor carriage M10, later supplemented by the 90mm gun motor carriage M36, both based on the M4 Sherman hull and powertrain, and the 76mm gun motor carriage M18, based on a unique hull and powertrain design, with a slight visual resemblance to what was used for the later M24 Chaffee light tank. The M18 came closest to the U.S. ideal. The vehicle was very fast, small, and mounted a 76mm gun in a roofless open turret. The M36 Jackson GMC possessed the only American-origin operational gun that could rival the vaunted 88mm German anti-tank ordnance. The 90mm M3 guns and the M36 remained in service well after World War II. The only dedicated American-origin, casemate hull design fighting vehicle of any type to be built during the war, that resembled the German and Soviet tank destroyers in hull and general gun mounting design, was the experimental T-28 Super Heavy tank, which mounted a 105mm T-5E1 long-barrel cannon, which had a maximum firing range of 12 miles. And was originally designed as a self-propelled assault gun to breach Germany's Siegfried Line defenses. Of these tank destroyers, only the 90mm gun of the M36 proved to be effective against the frontal armor of Germany's larger armored vehicles at long range. The open-top and light armor made these tank destroyers vulnerable to anything greater than small arms fire. As the number of German tanks encountered by American forces steadily decreased throughout the war, most battalions were split up and assigned to infantry units as supporting arms, fighting as assault guns or being used essentially as tanks. Doctrinists' expectation that German tanks would be engaged in mass formation was a failed assumption. In reality, German attacks effectively utilized combined arms on the ground fighting cohesively. American tank destroyer battalions comprised 3 tank destroyer companies supported by 9 security sections. The single-purpose tactics of the tank destroyer battalion failed to account for non-tank threats. British tanks in the early years of the war, both infantry and cruiser, were equipped with a gun capable of use against contemporary enemy tanks, the 40mm Ordnance QF 2-pounder. This was replaced with the 57mm Ordnance QF 6-pounder when that became available. There was extra impetus given to the development of anti-tank weaponry, which culminated in the 76mm Ordnance QF 17-pounder, widely considered one of the best anti-tank guns of the war. Towed anti-tank guns were the domain of the Royal Artillery rather than the Royal Armoured Corps, and vehicles adapted to mount artillery, including anti-tank self-propelled guns such as the Deacon and Archer, were there preserved, as were U.S.-supplied vehicles. The self-propelled guns that were built in the tank destroyer mold came about through the desire to field the QF 17-pounder anti-tank gun and simultaneous lack of suitable standard tanks to carry it. As a result, they were of a somewhat extemporized nature. Mounting the gun on the Valentine tank chassis in a fixed superstructure gave the Archer, looking somewhat like the light chassis German Marder III in appearance. The 17-pounder was also used to re-equip the U.S.-supplied M10 tank destroyer, replacing the American 3-inch gun to produce the 17 PDR-SP Achilles. While there was a general move to a general-purpose gun that was usable against both tanks and in supporting infantry, there was a need to put the 17 PDR into a tank for use against the enemy's heavy tanks. The cruiser Mk8 Challenger was a project to bring a 17 PDR tank into use to support the Cromwell cruiser tank. Delays led to it being outnumbered in use by the Sherman Firefly, but a derivative of Challenger was the more or less open-topped variant Avenger, which was delayed until post-war before entering service. A cut-down 17 PDR, the 77 mmHV, was used to equip the Comet tank in the last year of the war. The closest the British came to developing an armoured tank destroyer in the vein of the German Jagdpanzers or Soviet ISU series was the Churchill 3-inch gun carrier, a Churchill tank chassis with a boxy superstructure in place of the turret and mounting a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. Although a number were ordered, they were not put into service as the immediate threat passed. The design was rejected in favor of developing a 17-pounder armed Cromwell tank variant, ultimately leading to the Comet tank. The Tortoise, heavy assault tank, intended for use in breaking through fixed defensive lines. was well armored and had a very powerful 32-pounder gun, but did not reach service use. By 1944, a number of the Shermans in British use were being converted to Sherman Fireflies by adding the QF 17-pounder gun. Initially this gave each troop of Shermans one powerfully armed tank. By war's end, through the production of more Fireflies and the replacement of Shermans by British tanks, about 50% of Shermans in British service were Fireflies. Post-World War II, in the face of the Warsaw Pact, a general need for extra firepower was identified. In the 1950s, the UK produced the FV 4101 Charioteer to beef up the tank regiments, mounting a 20-pounder gun in an oversized turret on the Cromwell tank hull. It lacked the all-round capability of the Centurion tank. In the late 1960s, Germany developed the Kanonenjagdpanzer, essentially a modernized World War II Jagdpanzer mounting a 90mm gun. As Soviet designs became more heavily armored, the 90mm gun became ineffective and the Kanonenjagdpanzers were retrofitted for different roles or retired. Some provisions were made for the fitting of a 105mm cannon, and many of the vehicles were modified to fire hot auto missiles in place of a main gun. These upgraded variants remained in service into the 1990s. With the development of flexible anti-tank missiles, which were capable of installation on almost any vehicle in the 1960s, the concept of the tank destroyer has morphed into light vehicles with missiles. With the weight of main battle tanks growing to the 40 to 70-ton range, airborne forces were unable to deploy reasonable anti-tank forces. The result was a number of attempts to make a light vehicle, including the conventional ASU-85, the recoilless rifle-armed Ontis, and missile-armed Hornet Milkara armored car and Sheridan light assault vehicle. The latest entry into that category is the 2S25 Sprute SD, armed with a current issue 125mm tank gun that is also capable of launching missiles like the 9M119 SVIR.